You're a relic, Mom. A fossil. Get out. My daughter Jessica's voice, a sound I once associated with lullabies and scraped knees, was now sharp and distorted, amplified by the small speaker on her iPhone for the entertainment of thousands of strangers. It echoed across the polished, moneyed streets of downtown Austin, each word a stone thrown from the balcony of her penthouse. Then came my clothes, a lifetime of simple, carefully kept garments, a fabric archive of my 68 years, rained down onto the pavement below. The first to fall was a floral dress, a splash of faded blues and pinks I'd bought for a summer wedding 20 years ago. It caught the Texas wind for a moment, a pathetic, brief dance, before it collapsed near a gleaming black parking meter. Then a beige cardigan, the one with the slightly frayed cuffs that I'd knitted myself during a long winter, its descent slower, sadder. It snagged on a street sign that read "Walk," a bitter piece of irony. On her phone, a device I had helped pay for, I could see the screen's reflection against the glass of the balcony. Digital hearts, like tiny, insincere pulses of blood, floated upwards. Laughing emojis with their cruel crescent eyes and wide, mocking mouths flooded the comments section. They were cheering for this. "My influencer friends are coming over," she sneered, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial stage whisper for her audience. She was performing. This was content. "And I just can't have you stinking up the place with your sadness." Sadness. She said the word as if it were a contagion, a foul odor that clung to my old sweaters and worn-out slippers. Down below on the hot, unforgiving concrete that radiated the day's heat, I, Eliza, stood in a threadbare house dress and the thin socks I'd worn to bed. I was watching the public execution of my dignity. My life, my memories, my very being were being turned into confetti and thrown at my feet. A pair of my orthopedic shoes, sensible and plain, landed with a soft, dull thud on the hood of a parked Prius, setting off its alarm in a series of frantic electronic shrieks. A few passers-by turned their heads. A man in a business suit quickened his pace, his eyes fixed firmly ahead, refusing to be a witness. A group of college students, however, stopped. One of them raised his phone, no doubt to capture his own angle of the spectacle. I was becoming a viral moment. Jessica held her phone up, panning from my scattered belongings on the ground back to her own face, which was a mask of practiced indignation. "See? This is what I have to deal with," she announced to the ether. "It's about setting boundaries. It's about protecting your energy from toxic people, even if they're family." Family. The word felt alien. The girl on that balcony, with her perfectly sculpted eyebrows and a voice dripping with monetized victimhood, was not the child I had raised. The child I raised used to hide in the folds of that very floral dress when she was scared of thunderstorms. She used to beg me to wear that beige cardigan because she said it made my hugs warmer. Now she was using those same objects as props in a cruel play of her own design. More items fell. A silk scarf Robert had given me on our 30th anniversary. It was light, and it lingered in the air the longest, a shimmering ghost of a memory, before settling delicately over a public trash can. The box of my late husband's letters, which I had kept tied with a simple ribbon, hit the ground and burst open. Dozens of thin, brittle envelopes scattered across the sidewalk, their intimate cursive now just illegible squiggles for the world to trample on. I saw a young woman in yoga pants step directly on one, her sneaker leaving a dirty tread mark across Robert's handwriting. She didn't even notice. I didn't cry. The tears were there, somewhere deep inside, but they were frozen, trapped behind a wall of sheer, uncomprehending shock. My body felt like it didn't belong to me. My feet were rooted to the spot, 2 blocks of cement. My hands, hanging limply at my sides, felt like foreign objects. I could feel the sun on my scalp, the slight burn starting on my skin, but it was a distant sensation, happening to someone else. My entire consciousness had narrowed to a single sharp point, the image of my daughter 20 floors up, smiling for her followers as she dismantled me piece by piece. She was laughing now, not the performative sneer from before, but a genuine throaty laugh, triggered by a comment that must have flashed across her screen. The sound was perhaps the most painful part of it all. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated joy at my expense. It was the sound that finally, definitively, severed the last thread of maternal love that still tethered me to her. That laugh was an acid dissolving years of sacrifice, of sleepless nights, of unconditional support, into nothing. From inside the penthouse, I heard the bass of some trendy soulless music start to throb. Her friends were arriving. The party was starting. Jessica gave one last look down at me, a look of utter contempt, as if I were a piece of trash she had successfully taken out. She blew a kiss to her phone. "Love you guys. Time to celebrate my new positive mom-free life," she chirped, and then with a final dismissive flick of her wrist, she disappeared from the balcony, sliding the glass door shut behind her. The show was over. The silence she left behind was louder than her insults. The car alarm had finally stopped. The college kids, having gotten their content, were moving on, laughing and looking down at their screens. The world resumed its normal rhythm. The traffic flowed, people walked by, but my world had stopped. I was left alone in the wreckage. My life lay scattered around me on a 100-foot patch of dirty Austin sidewalk. A worn nightgown, a pair of reading glasses, a framed photo of Robert and me on our wedding day, its glass now shattered. For a long moment I just stood there. I was a statue of public shame. I watched as a gust of wind caught one of Robert's letters and sent it skittering down the street, where it came to rest in a puddle of grimy water. I watched as a dog, being walked by its owner, sniffed curiously at the sleeve of my cardigan before being yanked away. Each small indignity was another grain of salt being rubbed into an open wound. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. I didn't feel sorrow. That would come later, in the lonely hours of the night. What I felt was a strange, chilling clarity. It was the kind of clarity that comes after a devastating explosion, when the smoke has cleared and you can finally see the full extent of the damage. In that moment, standing on the hot pavement, surrounded by the tatters of my past, I understood. The daughter I knew was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw me not as a mother, but as a liability to her brand. An obstacle to her happiness. A relic. Slowly, deliberately I bent down. My knees cracked in protest. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the first object I saw, the shattered picture frame. I carefully picked out the photograph of Robert and me. His face was smiling, forever young, forever kind. My face, the face of a young bride full of hope, looked back at me. I tucked the photo into the pocket of my house dress. It was the only thing I took. I left the rest. I left the clothes, the letters, the memories, all of it lying there on the sidewalk to be swept away with the day's other garbage. I straightened up, my back aching, and turned away from the gleaming, soulless tower that housed the person who was once my child. I didn't look back. I just started to walk, my destination unknown, with nothing but the thin dress on my back, the socks on my feet, and the ghost of a smile in my pocket. I just watched the city swallow me whole. To the world, and especially to my daughter Jessica, I was simply Eliza Vance. 68 years old, a widow. A quiet, unassuming woman who smelled faintly of lavender and old books. The kind of woman you'd see tending her roses in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The kind of woman who fades into the background, a soft, blurry shape in the vibrant, high-definition world of others. For a time, that's all I wanted to be. After my husband, Robert, passed away, the silence in our family home became a physical weight. Every creak of the floorboards was a ghost. Every empty chair at the dinner table an accusation. So I sold it. I sold the house where Jessica took her first steps, the walls that had absorbed decades of our laughter and our tears. I sold the garden where Robert and I had spent countless Sunday afternoons, our hands in the cool earth, planning a future that was supposed to last so much longer. I packed a lifetime of memories into a few cardboard boxes and handed my daughter a cashier's check for $2 million. I can still see the look on her face, the way her eyes, so much like her father's, widened at the string of zeros. "Buy yourself a future, darling," I'd whispered, my hand trembling slightly as I pressed the slip of paper into hers. "Build something beautiful." She bought a penthouse at the Austonian, a gleaming spear of glass and steel that punctured the Austin sky. And I, the ghost of her past, moved into the spare room. In the fog of my grief, I believed that proximity would equal comfort. I thought that by being near my only child, I could somehow stitch the frayed edges of my life back together. I was wrong. The spare room was small and sterile, with a window that looked out onto a concrete wall. It was a space for things that are forgotten, and I soon learned that I was one of them. There was a time when I was not a ghost. Before I was a wife, before I was a mother, I was a biochemist. I lived in a world of precise calculations and elegant formulas. My mind was a place of sharp angles and brilliant light, a place where I could unravel the complex secrets of the universe. I had a name, a reputation. Colleagues respected my work. I published papers that were debated and cited. I found a deep, soul-quenching satisfaction in the logic and order of science. But then Robert fell ill. His was a long, slow decline, a battle fought not in weeks or months but in years. I didn't think twice. I packed up my office, I withdrew my name from research projects, I let my professional credentials lapse. I traded my lab coat for a caregiver's apron. My focus shifted from cellular respiration to his labored breaths, from complex protein folding to the simple, sacred task of holding his hand through the long, dark nights. I let that sharp, brilliant version of myself fade into a softer, quieter form. A woman whose entire universe was the man sleeping fitfully in the next room. And I never for one second regretted it. Love, I believed, was its own form of beautiful, complex science. After he was gone, that quiet devotion simply transferred its focus to Jessica. I saw her life, a whirlwind of bright lights, curated images, and the constant, buzzing approval of strangers on the internet. And I thought my role was to be her anchor, her quiet, stable, unconditional foundation. I became the ghost in her glamorous life, the one who made sure her designer clothes were perfectly laundered, who had a hot meal waiting no matter what time she stumbled in, who listened patiently to endless stories about brand deals and follower counts, concepts I could never truly grasp. I let myself become small so that her world could feel big. I thought that was what a mother did. I thought it was my final and most important act of love. But that was the story we told the world. The story I let Jessica believe because the truth was too vast, too dangerous. The truth was written in a language she didn't know I spoke. A language of code and heat, and whispered secrets in the dead of night. What Jessica never knew, what the world never knew, was that her father, Robert Vance, the mild-mannered accountant, was a phantom. In the nascent Wild West days of the internet, when the digital world was a frontier being mapped out by a handful of visionaries and rebels, Robert was a legend. He just wasn't a legend under his own name. To a very small, very specific group of people, he was Morpheus. He wasn't balancing ledgers. He was a pioneer. A cypherpunk who saw the future in a string of code. He began mining Bitcoin when a single coin was worth less than a dirty penny. When the very idea of a decentralized digital currency was a lunatic's dream. And I wasn't just his doting wife, blissfully unaware of the revolution happening in our garage. I was his partner. I was the architect behind the architect. Robert was the visionary, the one who could see the new world coming. But I was the pragmatist, the scientist who made his vision physically possible. His first crude mining rigs were monsters of raw power, cobbled together from scavenged parts and a prayer. They generated a colossal amount of heat, enough to warp the foundations and threaten to burn our quiet suburban life to the ground. He was a genius with code, but he was stumped by the unforgiving laws of physics. I remember one night, the air in the garage was thick and scorching, smelling of ozone and melting plastic. Robert was frantic, pacing back and forth, his face slick with sweat. He was convinced the project was a failure. I walked in, took one look at his chaotic setup, and the old part of me, the biochemist who understood energy transfer and entropy, woke from its long slumber. I picked up a piece of chalk and began to sketch on the concrete floor. I drew diagrams for a closed-loop liquid cooling system, calculated flow rates and heat dissipation coefficients. I used my knowledge of thermodynamics to design a system that not only kept the rigs from melting through the floor, but optimized their performance tenfold. Robert just stood there watching me, his eyes wide with a look I hadn't seen since our university days. It was a look of awe. From that day on, we weren't just husband and wife. We were partners in the truest sense. He was Morpheus, the digital ghost. I was the one who kept the ghost in the machine. Together we built an empire. Not of stocks and bonds, but of pure, incorruptible code. Our fortune wasn't sitting in a bank, vulnerable to crashes and government seizures. It was an abstraction, a silent giant living on the blockchain, secured in a decentralized, untraceable trust of our own design. We wove a tapestry of cryptographic keys and security protocols so complex, so elegant, that it made Fort Knox look like a child's piggy bank. We built a fortress of digital silence around a fortune so vast it could reshape nations. We kept it a secret even from Jessica because we wanted her to have a normal life. We didn't want her to grow up with the corrosive weight of that kind of wealth, to have her identity defined by it. We wanted her to find her own path, to build her own future, to become her own person. It was our greatest act of protection, our final gift. The irony is a blade that twists in my heart now. In trying to give her a normal life, we kept her from knowing who we truly were. And in her ignorance, she saw me not as her protector, the silent guardian of her future, but as a relic, a faded, lavender-scented burden from a past she was desperate to erase. She had no idea the ghost she was trying to exorcise from her perfect, curated life was the very architect of the world she stood upon. The poison wasn't a single dose. It was a slow, methodical drip, administered daily in portions so small you could almost convince yourself it was just water. It began with the space I was allowed to occupy. This penthouse, bought with the money Robert and I had bled for, became a stage, and I was the unsightly piece of set dressing that had to be hidden when the audience arrived. Jessica's friends, they called themselves creators, but I never saw them create anything but noise and selfies. They glide in on waves of expensive perfume, their voices high and brittle, their laughter like shattering glass. On those nights the rule was simple. I was to eat in the kitchen. The first time it happened, Jessica had framed it as a kindness. "Mom, it's so loud out here, you'll be much more comfortable in the kitchen. I'll bring you a plate." I remember nodding, the lie so gentle I almost believed it. But the plate she brought was a plastic one, the kind you use for a picnic, piled with the slightly overcooked vegetables and the driest piece of chicken, while the scent of truffle oil and seared scallops wafted in from the dining room. I sat on a hardback stool, my feet not quite touching the floor, listening to the clinking of real cutlery on porcelain, a ghost in my own home. Soon the pretense of kindness vanished. It became a command. "Friends are coming over. Eat in the kitchen." Her voice would have that flat, final tone, the one that brooked no argument. "You'll just kill the vibe, Mom. You know how you get." How did I get? Quiet? Old? A reminder that life wasn't all sponsored posts and brand deals? Yes, I suppose I was all of those things. I was a walking, breathing vibe killer. I learned to make myself small. I'd eat quickly, wash my plastic plate and fork, and retreat to my room, the one with the window that faced a brick wall. The sound of their party would seep through the door, a muffled bassline of a life I had no part in. Then came the financial erosion. I had insisted, after Robert's death, on keeping my small pension. It was a pittance, but it was mine. It was the last vestige of a life where I had agency. To Jessica, it was just a convenient supplementary line of credit. It started with a Fendi bag. She'd held her phone up to me, her eyes wide with a manufactured desperation I'd seen her use on her followers 1,000 times. "Mom, it's a crucial investment for my brand. It's half off, but the sale ends tonight. I'll pay you back next week, I promise." The word promise fell from her lips so easily, a smooth, polished stone with no weight to it. I gave her the card. The money, of course, never returned. When I asked a week later, my voice barely a whisper, she'd sighed dramatically. "Oh my God, Mom, don't be so transactional. We're family." It became a ritual. My pension would arrive on the 1st of the month, and by the 3rd it would be gone, siphoned off for a life-changing trip to Dubai, a networking opportunity in Miami, or a new set of veneers to make her smile more brand-friendly. She didn't even bother with the promises anymore. She'd just take my purse from the hook by the door. "Need to borrow this," she'd call out, already halfway to the elevator, leaving me with an empty wallet and a hollow feeling in my chest. Arguing was pointless. It only led to the quiet punishments. The Wi-Fi password would be mysteriously changed, or the cable box would suddenly require a 4-digit PIN I was never given. I was being systematically disconnected, not just from my own money but from the world itself. The silence was the worst part. We lived in the same apartment, but we could go days without speaking. I would move through the vast, white spaces like a shadow, My footsteps silenced by the plush rugs. She would be glued to her phone, her face illuminated by its cold blue light, her thumbs flying across the screen. Sometimes I would stand in the doorway of the living room and just watch her. This stranger I had raised. She would scroll and tap, a faint self-satisfied smile on her face as the likes and comments poured in. She never looked up. I could have been a piece of furniture, a lamp, a ghost. It was a profound and terrifying invisibility. I was a mother being erased pixel by pixel, by the daughter who was building a life out of them. The moment the mother in me died, it wasn't with a bang, but with a laugh. A bright, tinkling, utterly genuine laugh. She was live-streaming as she always was. The ring light cast a halo around her perfectly styled hair, turning her eyes into vacant, shimmering pools. She was perched on a sterile white sofa, performing for the thousands of anonymous faces behind the screen. Her boyfriend, Chad, a man whose personality was a collection of crypto buzzwords and gym selfies, sauntered into the frame. He draped a heavy, tattooed arm around her shoulders, his smile a flash of predatory white. I was in the kitchen, of course, rinsing a cup in the sink, my back to them, but I could see their reflection in the dark glass of the microwave. I watched them as they preened for their audience, two beautiful, hollow people. Chad leaned in and spoke into the phone's microphone, his voice dripping with condescending charm. "So babe," he said, loud enough for me and the entire internet to hear. "I've been thinking, when are we putting the old lady in Sunset Villas?" The name hung in the air. Sunset Villas. It was a place we all knew. A name that was whispered in Austin as a synonym for despair. A grim, underfunded nursing home on the edge of town, where the elderly were sent to be forgotten. A place that smelled of bleach and regret. He grinned, playing to the camera. "For real though. We need her room for my new streaming setup. The lighting in there is way better." A cold dread washed over me. I stood frozen, the water running over my hands, my knuckles white on the edge of the sink. I waited for Jessica to defend me, to slap his arm away, to tell him not to be so cruel, to flash that fake, camera-ready smile and change the subject. A part of me, the hopelessly maternal part, still expected her to be my daughter. Instead, she threw her head back and laughed. It wasn't a small, polite chuckle. It wasn't a nervous titter. It was a deep, throaty, genuine laugh of pure, unadulterated amusement. It was the laugh of someone who had heard the funniest, truest joke in the world. The sound echoed in the cavernous, minimalist apartment, sharp and clear and brutal. In the reflection in the microwave, I saw her face, unguarded for a single horrifying second. It was filled with a glee that was terrifying. In that single crystalline moment, something inside me fractured. The years of quiet love, of sacrifice, of hope that the daughter I remembered was still in there somewhere. It all turned to dust. The quiet, grieving widow who sold her home to give her child a future. The mother who ate leftovers on a plastic plate. The woman who made herself invisible to avoid killing the vibe. She died right there at the stainless steel sink, with the sound of her daughter's laughter as her eulogy. And in the silent, cold space she left behind, something else stirred. It was a part of me I had buried long ago with Robert. It was the biochemist who understood catalysis, the precise application of an agent to create an explosive reaction. It was the partner who understood thermodynamics, who knew how to keep complex systems from overheating. It was the architect of an empire built on secrets and code. I turned off the water. My hands were steady. I looked at my own reflection in the dark glass, past the shimmering image of my daughter and her cruel, laughing boyfriend. I saw the lines on my face, the silver in my hair. For the first time in a long time, I didn't see a sad old woman. I saw a strategist. The laughter from the living room faded into a dull, meaningless buzz. The game had changed. They just didn't know it yet. The Cold War that followed that laugh was fought in silence. The apartment, already lacking in warmth, became a mausoleum. I moved through it with a new purpose. I was no longer just enduring. I was observing, collecting data, running diagnostics on the flaw in my life's most significant creation. I saw the casual cruelty in everything. The way she'd leave a single, dirty dish in the sink for me to find. The way she'd turn the volume on her phone up when I was trying to read. The way she spoke about me to Chad when she thought I couldn't hear, referring to me only as her. The final battle, the one that led to the sidewalk sermon, wasn't over money or respect. It was over a box. A simple cardboard box filled with old photographs. It was the only thing I had insisted on bringing with me from our old house, a tangible archive of a life lived and loved. She found it while ransacking my closet, looking for a suitcase she could borrow for a trip to Tulum. I heard the thump as she pulled it from the top shelf. "What is all this dusty junk?" she called out, her voice laced with irritation. I walked into the room to see her holding a photograph of Robert and me on our wedding day. We were so young, impossibly young, squinting in the sun, our faces alight with a future we couldn't possibly have imagined. To me it was everything. To her, it was an artifact from an irrelevant civilization. "This is clutter, Mom," she said, dropping the photo back into the box with a careless flick of her wrist. "Seriously, it has to go. It's taking up valuable storage real estate." "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it felt heavy in the air between us. It was the first time in years I hadn't acquiesced. I reached for the box. "That's mine, Jessica. Please give it to me." "Don't be ridiculous," she scoffed, holding the box away from me. "It's just old paper. Let it go." "It's my past," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's your past, too." She looked at me then, and her eyes were cold, hard voids. There was no recognition, no empathy. "My past?" she sneered. "My past is a brand I'm building. This," she gestured to the box, "this doesn't fit the aesthetic." I reached again, my fingers brushing the worn cardboard edge. I had to save them. I had to save him. And then she pushed me. It wasn't a violent shove, not really. It was a firm, dismissive push to the chest with the flat of her hand. But it sent me stumbling backward, my body weaker than I realized. I caught myself on the doorframe, my heart hammering against my ribs. Her grip had been surprisingly strong, the casual strength of youth and entitlement. She looked down at me, her expression not of anger, but of finality, like a landlord evicting a tenant who had violated the terms of their lease. "It's my apartment, Mom," she said, her voice chillingly calm. "My apartment, my rules." That was it. The final line of code in a program of cruelty. Not our apartment. My apartment. The $2 million, the life I had given her, had purchased her the right to disown me, to erase me, to physically put me in my place. And my place was wherever she deemed it to be. The argument that followed was a blur of her shouting and my silence. The silence of a strategist who has just received the last piece of intelligence needed to launch a full-scale assault. I didn't fight back. I didn't cry. I simply stood there as she worked herself into a frenzy, her voice echoing off the sterile white walls. I was a ghost already, and she was just trying to exorcise me. That shove was the beginning of the end. It was the force that propelled me from the closet, through the living room and metaphorically, out onto the balcony where my clothes would soon follow, a pathetic confetti of a life she deemed clutter. As I stood on that street corner hours later, watching my life rain down on the pavement, it wasn't the dresses or the sweaters I saw. It was that box of photographs, the feel of her hand on my chest, and the cold, dead finality in her eyes as she said, "My apartment. My rules." After Jessica slammed the balcony door shut, the sound of flat, ugly crack in the Austin afternoon, I didn't go to a shelter. I didn't look for a friend's couch or a cheap motel. The performance on the sidewalk was over. The curtain of my old life had fallen, and I felt nothing but a profound and chilling calm. I walked 2 blocks, the heat rising in waves from the pavement, my mind a silent, ordered space. I found myself standing under the garish red and white sign of a KFC. The smell of fried chicken, a scent from 1,000 forgotten road trips with Robert, felt like a message from a different universe. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous tune over the sticky tables and worn linoleum. I ordered a 2-piece meal, my voice even, betraying nothing of the woman whose life had just been detonated for a global audience. I sat in a booth by the window, the plastic cool against my skin, and methodically ate a drumstick, tearing the meat from the bone with a precision that felt alien. When I was done, I wiped my hands carefully on a thin napkin. From the hidden pocket sewn into the seam of my simple cotton dress, I pulled a small, featureless black device. It was smooth, cool, and heavy like a river stone. A hardware wallet. To anyone else, it was a meaningless piece of plastic. To me, it was a key. I pressed my thumb against the small, unmarked indentation on its surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a faint blue light glowed from within, and a tiny holographic display flickered to life in the air just above it, a shimmering private miracle in the greasy air of the fast food restaurant. It showed a string of numbers, long and complex, followed by 3 letters, BTC. The balance was 9 figures. This was my personal access point, my go-bag in digital form. It was a sliver of the fortune, a carefully partitioned-off emergency fund I could touch without triggering the main protocols, without waking the sleeping giant that Robert and I had built. It was enough to disappear, to live a life of quiet luxury anywhere in the world. But quiet luxury was no longer the goal. This wasn't escape money. It was war money. The real fortune, the heart of our empire, was locked away in a digital vault we'd named the Prometheus Trust. It was protected by a multi-signature protocol, a fortress with 2 locks, requiring 2 keys to be turned simultaneously. I held one key. The other, the one that now felt like a mountain I had to move, was held by Robert's estranged brother, Julian. He was a ghost, a paranoid cypherpunk who had scrubbed his existence from the modern world decades ago. He lived completely off-grid, somewhere in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Montana, nursing a grudge that had festered for years. Julian had never forgiven me for Robert's illness. In his mind, my scientific pragmatism, my acceptance of the doctor's prognosis, was a betrayal. He saw Robert's death not as a tragedy of biology but as a failure of my care, a surrender he would have never made. The last time we spoke was at the funeral, his words like shards of ice. "You let him go," he'd hissed, his face pale with a fanatic's grief. "You just stood by and let him go." He hadn't spoken to me since. Now I needed him. Finding a man who didn't want to be found was one challenge. Convincing that man, who saw me as the architect of his pain, to cooperate in a venture that would require absolute trust that felt like a monumental, almost impossible task. My 9-figure wallet felt small and insignificant against the weight of that one missing key. Before I could even begin to map out a strategy for Montana, I needed more immediate operating cash. The Bitcoin in my burner wallet was untouchable in its raw form. I needed to liquidate a small fraction, turn it into clean, untraceable currency to fund the first phase of my plan. I used a public library computer, routing my connection through a series of encrypted nodes that bounced my signal across 3 continents. I accessed one of our oldest, most dormant exchange accounts, one Robert had set up under a pseudonym in the early days. It was a relic, but it was clean. I initiated a small transfer, a negligible amount, just enough to secure transportation, new clothes, and the tools I would need. I typed in the passphrase from memory, my fingers moving with an old familiar rhythm. The transfer was confirmed, and then the screen went red. Access denied. Account locked. Unusual activity detected. A security protocol I had completely forgotten about slammed shut. It was Robert's digital ghost, a final paranoid masterpiece. Years ago, he had coded an AI security demon into our accounts, a silent guardian programmed with a deep, algorithmic understanding of our habits. My sudden activity on an account that had been silent for half a decade was, to the demon, the screaming red flag of a hack. I was locked out. A single line of text appeared on the screen, cold and impersonal. Identity verification required. Answer the following questions to restore access. 3 incorrect answers will result in permanent cryptographic erasure of the account. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a lockout. It was a potential wipe. Robert, in his genius and his paranoia, had designed a failsafe that could now destroy a small but crucial piece of my arsenal. The first question materialized. What was the name of the stray cat we fed during the 1998 ice storm? It was a question designed to be unanswerable by anyone but me. A memory buried under 20 years of life and loss. The ice storm. I could remember the silver sheen on the tree branches, the way the power was out for a week, the smell of the kerosene heater. We were so young. The cat, it was gray with a torn ear. It would cry on the back porch. We fed it leftover tuna. What was its name? It was a stupid name, a joke between us. My mind was a fog, the memory obscured by the heavy curtain of my grief. I could see Robert smile, hear his laugh, but the name wouldn't come. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of my composure. I typed, "Patches." Incorrect. One attempt remaining. The screen flashed. My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't Patches. It was something from one of his books, a mythology reference. He was always doing that. I closed my eyes, forcing myself back into that frozen little house, the candlelight flickering on the pages of the book he was reading. Mercury. That was it. I typed it in. Correct. The relief was so intense it left me dizzy. A new question appeared. In our first apartment, what was the title of the water-stained book you used to prop up the broken leg of the coffee table? This was his love language. Not flowers or poems, but a shared fortress of memory, impenetrable to all outsiders. He was testing me from beyond the grave, forcing me to walk back through the halls of our life together, to prove I was who I said I was by remembering the woman I used to be, the woman who existed long before the penthouse, before Jessica, before the widow's veil. Each question was a key, but it was also a ghost, a fresh wave of grief I had to wade through to get to the other side. Failure meant more than losing money. It felt like a second, final death for the life we had built. As I battled the digital ghost of my husband, a more corporeal threat was beginning to stir. Chad. I had always dismissed him as vapid, a handsome, empty vessel for Jessica's ambitions. But I had underestimated the insatiable nature of his greed. My public humiliation, followed by my complete and utter disappearance, didn't compute in his world. People like me, in his experience, didn't just vanish. They went on talk shows, they wrote tell-all articles, they sued. My silence was suspicious. It smelled like a secret. And where there were secrets, he believed there was money. My plan required me to be a ghost, a non-entity. But Chad had started digging. Using the tools I had at my disposal, I watched his digital shadow. He wasn't subtle. He was a brute force investigator hammering away at the past. He started with Robert's old online profiles. He found obscure forum posts from the early 2000s, message boards dedicated to cryptography and decentralized finance, places where Robert, under the handle Morpheus, had been a founding voice, a prophet. Chad was sniffing around the edges of the legend, typing Morpheus and Robert Anderson and early Bitcoin into every search engine he could find. He wouldn't understand the complexities, not the way Robert and I did. But he didn't need to. He just needed to find a loose thread, a single connection between the quiet accountant Robert Anderson and the mythical Morpheus. He was a digital bloodhound, and he was getting closer to my scent every day. My anonymity, the very foundation of my plan, was eroding under the clumsy, greedy prodding of my daughter's boyfriend. He was a direct and escalating threat, a ticking clock I hadn't anticipated. And then a memory surfaced that was so cold, so terrifying, it eclipsed everything else. A ghost of my own making. My greatest mistake. It came to me while I was staring at the library computer screen, agonizing over a security question about the vintage of wine we drank on our 10th anniversary. I remembered the days after Robert's funeral, a hollowed-out period of pure, undiluted grief. I was adrift, and Jessica, in her own way, was trying to be there. She'd asked me for something of her father's, something personal. Not his watch or his books. Something that was just for her. In a moment of profound weakness, desperate to give her a piece of the man she barely knew, a piece of the world he had really inhabited, I had made a catastrophic error. I had taken a 12-word seed phrase for a secondary wallet, a significant, but not catastrophic, holding, and written it down on a beautiful piece of cardstock. I told her it was a poem her father had written for her. He wasn't much for words, you know, I had whispered, my voice thick with tears. But he wrote this. For you. Keep it safe. The 12 words were random, nonsensical together. River, Atlas, Whisper, Cobalt, Echo, Silent, Iron, Hazard, Orbit, Magnet, Anchor, Future. To her, it was a piece of sentimental ephemera. She probably tucked it away in a jewelry box, a strange abstract memento from her dead father. I thought she would treasure it for the sentiment, a harmless, loving lie. Now that lie was a weapon pointed directly at my heart. With Chad's new obsession with Robert's digital past, it was no longer a question of if they would figure it out, but when. When they realized that the poem wasn't a poem at all, but a key. A key that would not only give them access to a substantial amount of cryptocurrency, but would also provide a clear, traceable link on the blockchain. A link that, with enough analysis, could lead them from that secondary wallet straight to the network of assets that formed the Prometheus Trust. My act of love had become a landmine. My attempt to connect my daughter to her father's legacy had given her the very tool she could use to uncover and destroy it. The weight of that mistake settled in my bones, a cold, heavy dread. I was fighting a war on 4 fronts. A hostile brother in the wilderness, a digital ghost in the machine, a greedy bloodhound in my daughter's bed, and the most dangerous enemy of all, my own past, my own flawed love, my own terrible judgment. I finally answered the last security question, the name of the song playing on the radio when he first proposed. As the account access was restored, I felt no triumph. I just felt the walls closing in. As I was preparing to log out, a new message popped up from the demon. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Protocol Ghost. Final authentication. One-time message from originator. My breath caught in my throat. This was new. This wasn't part of the original security design I remembered. Robert must have added it later without telling me. A single line of text appeared. A message only I could possibly understand. It read, "Remember the Arecibo. Not what we sent but why. The key isn't in Montana. It's in the Echo." The message vanished. The Arecibo message. The binary radio signal we sent into space in the 70s. We were obsessed with it as young scientists. But his clue was specific. Not what we sent but why. We sent it to prove we could. To establish a connection, to communicate across an impossible distance. An echo. Julian. The key isn't in Montana. It's in the Echo. My mind raced, connecting nodes of information. Julian wasn't just off-grid. He was a communications obsessive. He ran a private, encrypted email server, a digital fortress he used to communicate with a tiny, vetted circle of fellow cypherpunks. He believed in echoes, in redundancies, in digital backups. Robert must have sent him his half of the Prometheus key not as a physical device, but as a piece of encrypted data. A file that sits on a server waiting for my half to complete it. He wouldn't have to. Agree. He wouldn't have to even speak to me. If I could get access to his server, if I could find the data packet Robert sent him, I could potentially reunify the keys myself. It was a long shot, a technical and cryptographic nightmare of a plan. But it was a plan that didn't rely on appealing to the humanity of a man who believed I had none. Robert, in his infinite foresight, had left me one last breadcrumb. A hidden path through an impossible obstacle. The cold dread in my veins was replaced by a flicker of something else. Not hope. It was too early for hope. It was the sharp, clean thrill of a complex problem, and the first glimpse of a devastatingly elegant solution. The architect in me was waking up. The fluorescent hum of the KFC was a poor substitute for the symphony of a life I once had, but it was a necessary purgatory. The grease-licked table was my altar. The hardware wallet my prayer book. I plugged the small device into the burner phone I just bought for cash at a 7-Eleven. My fingers, steady despite the tremors I felt in my soul, tapped in the 24-word passphrase. It was a litany Robert and I had devised, a nonsensical poem only we understood. For a moment the screen flickered, and then a number appeared. It wasn't the bulk of our fortune, not even a significant fraction, but it was more than enough. 9 figures. My personal account, the mad money Robert had insisted I keep separate. It was never meant for this. It was meant for spontaneous trips to Florence, for funding a ridiculous chemistry lab in our basement, for a life that was now just a collection of digital ghosts. I didn't feel a thrill of power, only the cold, heavy certainty of purpose. I transferred a small, untraceable amount of Bitcoin to a new, clean account, cashed it out through a series of tumblers, and walked out into the Texas sun, leaving my half-eaten meal behind. The old Eliza was finished. The lobby of the Four Seasons smelled of money and gardenias. I walked to the counter, a woman of 68 in a simple, practical dress, looking for all the world like a grandmother visiting from out of town. The concierge, a young man with a smile so polished it could reflect light, barely looked at me. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes already scanning for a more important guest. "Yes," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "I'd like the presidential suite." For a month. His professional smile flickered. He looked at me, then truly looked at me. At my worn but clean shoes, my simple cloth handbag. His mind was racing, trying to categorize me, and failing. Of course, ma'am. That suite is quite significant in price. I placed a newly minted black credit card on the marble countertop. It was a card tied to no name, backed by a significant deposit of very real, very clean cash. I'm aware, I said. I'll be paying in advance. I also require a direct view of the Ellington Tower. He swallowed, his polished demeanor cracking just enough for me to see the raw astonishment beneath. He typed furiously into his computer. The Ellington. Jessica's building. My daughter's gilded cage. Minutes later, I was ascending in a private elevator. The scent of gardenias replaced by the soft leather of the paneled walls. The suite was obscene. It was larger than the house Robert and I had raised Jessica in. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Austin, but I only had eyes for one building. There it was. The penthouse. A glass box in the sky. Through a pair of high-powered binoculars I'd requested, I could see a tiny figure on the balcony. Jessica. She was arching her back, phone held high, capturing her own silhouette against the sunset. A performance for an audience of strangers. She was a ghost in her own life and she didn't even know it. The first few days were a blur of methodical setup. I never left the suite. Room service brought my meals. I bought a new laptop, top-of-the-line military-grade encryption. Another burner phone for a different purpose. I spent hours online, not wandering through memories but hunting. I found a cybersecurity firm based in Tel Aviv, known for its discretion and its ruthlessness. The consultation was a video call with a man who had no name, just a string of characters. His face was a pixelated blur. What is the objective? He asked, his voice a digitized monotone. I want to monitor the online activity of two individuals, I said, my own voice calm and steady. Financial transactions, social media, communications, dark web mentions. I want to know when they spend $1, when they gain a follower, when they whisper in the dark. I gave them the names. Jessica Vance and Chad Peterson. This level of surveillance is comprehensive, the voice said. There was no judgment, just a statement of fact. I will compensate you for your comprehensiveness, I replied, transferring the first installment from my burner wallet. The next call was to a name I pulled from an article in Forbes about the most brutal divorce settlements in Texas history. Arthur Davies. The article called him the surgeon, for his ability to carve up fortunes with terrifying precision. His office was old money, dark wood, leather-bound books that had actually been read, the faint smell of whiskey and victory. Davies was a man in his 70s, with eyes that had seen the very worst of human greed. He listened to my story without interruption. I told him everything, from Jessica's slow-building cruelty to the final public humiliation on the sidewalk. I presented the archived TikTok video on my new laptop. He watched the little hearts and laughing emojis float across the screen as my daughter threw my life onto the pavement. His face remained a mask of professional neutrality. A compelling narrative, Mrs. Vance, he said when it was over, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. But emotion doesn't win in court. Assets do. What is the financial nexus? My daughter lives in a penthouse I paid for, I said. A gift? He asked, a hint of disappointment in his tone. Gifts are difficult to claw back. I'm not sure what to call it, I said, playing the part of the confused, grieving widow. It was $2 million, from the sale of our family home after my husband passed. He steepled his fingers. We'll begin with discovery. Subpoena her financial records. It will be a long, messy fight. I'd prefer a short, clean one, I said. And I don't want to sue my daughter. I want to foreclose on her. For the first time, a flicker of genuine interest lit up his pale eyes. He leaned forward. Eliza, he said, dropping the Mrs. Vance for the first time. Tell me everything about your husband. The next leg of my journey required more than just money. It required facing a ghost of a different kind. The flight to Bozeman, Montana was turbulent, a fitting overture for the meeting to come. From there, I hired a local guide. A grizzled man named Hank with a truck that looked like it had wrestled a bear and lost. We drove for hours, leaving paved roads behind, plunging deeper into the unforgiving beauty of the wilderness. He doesn't get many visitors, Hank grunted, navigating a path that was more rock than road. Especially not your type. He meant a woman my age dressed for the city. He didn't know I was more comfortable with the immutable laws of thermodynamics than I was with social media influencers. We stopped at the edge of a clearing. "This is as far as I go," Hank said, pointing towards a cabin in the distance. "He'll know you're here." The cabin was a contradiction. It was built of rough-hewn logs, primitive and isolated, but a large array of solar panels glinted on its roof, and a satellite dish was aimed at the sky like a defiant flower. Wires snaked from the main structure to a smaller, humming outbuilding. The air itself seemed to crackle with electricity and solitude. Julian emerged as I approached, Robert's younger brother. He looked like a prophet from a forgotten age, a wild gray beard, hair to his shoulders, and the same piercing blue eyes as my husband, but his were narrowed with a decade of accumulated bitterness. "Eliza," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation. "Julian," I replied, my voice even. "You have no business being here," he said, not moving to let me pass. The smell of pine and ozone hung in the air between us. "This is a place of logic, of code. You belong in the world of messy, sentimental flesh." "I need your help," I said, ignoring the insult. He laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Help? The way you helped Robert? You let him die in a hospital, Eliza. Plugged into machines, beeping and humming, surrounded by the sterile failures of medicine. He should have died here with his code. He should have been allowed to upload his consciousness to become one with the system he built. You denied him his immortality." The accusation hung in the crisp mountain air. It was an old argument, the one that had fractured their relationship long before Robert got sick, and the one that had shattered what was left of ours after he died. Julian, the cypherpunk purist, believed in the sanctity of the digital. Robert, for all his genius, had still believed in the sanctity of a shared life, of holding my hand. I didn't argue. I wouldn't win. The grief was his fortress, and I had no desire to lay siege to it. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a small laminated card. On it was a QR code. "Robert left a final message," I said. "For you." He embedded it in a transaction on the Genesis block, the very first one. "He knew you'd never stop monitoring it." Julian's eyes widened, the first crack in his hostile facade. The Genesis block was sacred ground for men like him. He snatched the card from my hand and disappeared into the cabin. I waited. The sun beat down on my neck. A hawk circled high overhead. I stood my ground, a statue of patience in a world that had forgotten the virtue. He was gone for almost an hour. When he returned, the anger in his eyes had been replaced by a profound, hollowed-out sorrow. He was holding a tablet, the screen displaying lines of hexadecimal code, but within it I knew was Robert's voice. "He asks me to trust you," Julian said, his own voice rough with emotion. He says you were the heat sink. That without you, his whole world would have melted down. It was what Robert called me, his heat sink, the one who managed the chaotic real-world thermodynamics while he lived in the cool, clean world of pure data. It was the most romantic thing he'd ever said to me. "He created a trust," I said softly. "The Prometheus trust. It holds everything. It requires 2 keys to unlock. Mine. And yours." Julian stared at the screen, at the ghost of his brother. "He tied me to you. Even in death, he's binding us together." He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. The bitterness was still there, a deep foundational layer. But on top of it was something new. The weight of a dying wish. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to take back what is mine," I said. "And what is ours? Our daughter. She has forgotten who we are. She was always your daughter more than his." he shot back, a flash of the old resentment. Perhaps, I conceded. But she is living in a house built by his genius. And she is using it to spit on his memory. That landed. The idea of Jessica's frivolous, vapid world being funded by Robert's life's work was an insult to the religion of code he and Julian shared. He was silent for a long time, the wind whispering through the pines the only sound. When the time is right, he finally said, his voice low and resolute, you send me the signal. I'll provide the second key. Not for you, Eliza. For him. He turned and walked back into his technological hermitage without another word. I had what I came for. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a key. Back in the cool, climate-controlled silence of my suite at the Four Seasons, the wilderness of Montana felt a world away. I scheduled another meeting with Arthur Davies. This time I didn't go to his office. He came to me. He walked into the suite, took in the opulent surroundings and the clear, predatory view of the Ellington Tower, and a slow, appreciative smile spread across his face. I see you're settling in, Eliza, he said, sitting in an armchair that probably cost more than my first car. I've made progress on a related family matter, I said, pouring him a glass of water. I believe access to the primary trust will be possible, should it be needed. He raised an eyebrow, impressed. Good, because I've also made progress. He opened his briefcase and laid a thick document on the glass coffee table. I did as you asked. I didn't start with Jessica's finances. I started with your husband's. I dove deep into the provenance of that $2 million. He tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the cover page. You didn't give Jessica the money, Eliza. You are the sole executor of the Robert Vance Legacy Trust, which loaned the funds to your daughter for the purchase of a primary residence. The room was silent. I looked at the document, the dense legal text swimming before my eyes. I had signed so many papers after Robert's death, my mind fogged with grief. I had trusted his lawyers, his accountants to handle the details. I had assumed it was a simple transfer. Robert set this up 5 years ago, Davies continued, his voice taking on the excited tone of a predator closing in on its prey. It's a masterpiece of paranoid estate planning. And right here on page 47 subsection C is the most beautiful thing I have ever read. He slid the document across to me, his finger pointing to a specific paragraph. I read the words and the air left my lungs in a single silent gasp. It was a morality clause. Robert, my careful, brilliant, forward-thinking Robert, had put it in himself. The language was precise, legalistic, and utterly devastating. Should the beneficiary, Jessica Vance, fail to provide care, comfort, and respect to her mother, Eliza Vance, as determined in the sole discretion of the executor, all assets provided by this trust, including any and all properties and instruments purchased with said assets, shall immediately revert to the trust. He foresaw this, I whispered, my hand tracing the words on the page. I felt a wave of love for my husband so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. He had seen the darkness in our daughter long before I was willing to. He had built me a lifeboat. He did more than that, Davies said, a genuine grin on his face now. He defined the evidence. The clause specifies that public acts of disrespect, whether documented in print, digital media, or broadcast, constitute an incurable breach of contract. He gestured toward my laptop, where the TikTok video was still saved. That live stream, Eliza? That isn't just grounds for a lawsuit. That is the execution order. It's time-stamped, archived, and witnessed by thousands. You don't have to sue her. You don't have to fight her. All you have to do as executor is sign a piece of paper declaring her in breach of the trust. And the penthouse? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Reverts. To you. The furniture, the art, the car she bought with the checking account tied to the trust. It all reverts. You can, quite literally, take everything. The plan, which had been a nebulous storm cloud of anger and strategy, suddenly snapped into perfect, terrifying focus. The pieces were all there. The money, the legal instrument, the second key to the real fortune waiting in the wings. All I needed was the right moment to strike. As if on cue, an email notification pinged on my laptop. It was the weekly report from the cybersecurity firm in Tel Aviv. I opened the encrypted file. It was a clinical, passionless summary of a life imploding. Chad's cryptocurrency portfolio was a sea of red. The market had turned, and his amateurish gambling had cost them dearly. Jessica's sponsorship deals were drying up. Her brand of vapid luxury was becoming stale. Their credit card statements were a litany of declined transactions and overdue notices. They were bleeding money, desperately trying to maintain an illusion that was cracking at the seams. And then I saw the final data point at the bottom of the report. It was a link to a new real estate listing. A beautiful, prestigious penthouse apartment in the Ellington Tower. Photos showed the sleek, modern interior, the balcony with its stunning views of the city. My home. My daughter's prison. It was officially for sale. They were desperate. They were over-leveraged. They were looking for a lifeline. And I, sitting in my silent suite across the street, was about to become the storm. The silent assembly was complete. Now it was time for the performance to begin. The notification from my lawyer chimed softly on the burner phone. A single, discreet vibration against the cool marble of the hotel room's coffee table. The transfer was complete. Prometheus Capital LLC, a deliberately anonymous and soulless entity registered in Delaware, was now the legal owner of Penthouse 34B at the Austonian. My daughter's penthouse. My penthouse. I didn't smile. The time for such simple, warm emotions was long past. This wasn't about joy. It was about balance. A correction in the universal ledger. Across the street, the floor-to-ceiling windows of her apartment blazed with light, a beacon of oblivious celebration against the velvet Austin night. I picked up my tablet, the one I'd purchased with cash just days ago, and tapped on the Instagram icon. Jessica's live stream was already active. The view was shaky as she held the phone, a flute of champagne in her other hand, weaving through a crowd of people who all looked a variation of herself, young, beautiful, and hungry for validation. The ambient bass of some generic pop song pulsed through the tablet's small speakers. "Oh my God, you guys. I can't believe it," she squealed, her voice artificially high for her audience. She panned the camera around the room, showing off the throng of influencers, the caterer's lavish spread of food she didn't pay for, the glittering skyline behind her. We did it. We officially sold the money pit. A roar of approval went through the crowd. Chad, ever the parasite, slid his arm around her waist and kissed her sloppily on the cheek. He grabbed the phone. "To my baby," he slurred, holding his own glass up to the camera. "For being smart enough to dump this place for double what it's worth. Double. To new beginnings and not having to deal with any more family drama." He winked. The implication was clear. I was the drama. I was the money pit. The comments on her live stream scrolled by in a dizzying, sycophantic blur. "Yes, queen. Get that bag. So happy for you. Level up." Thousands of hearts and fire emojis floated up the screen. A digital standing ovation for her cruelty. I watched, my face impassive, my own reflection a faint ghost on the dark screen. They were toasting their good fortune. A fortune they believed they had secured. They had no idea they were celebrating inside their own tomb, and the architect of it was watching from across the street. Jessica took the phone back. "The buyer was so random," she said, laughing. "Some faceless company. They didn't even negotiate. Just wired the money all cash. Who does that?" She took a long sip of champagne. "I guess some people just have more money than sense." I set the tablet down. The irony was a cold, hard stone in my chest. More money than sense. It was the exact phrase Robert's father had used to describe him when he first started talking about decentralized digital currencies 3 decades ago. Robert had a sense for the future, a vision that Jessica, in her short-sighted greed, could never comprehend. And I, the biochemist who understood thermodynamics better than anyone he knew, was the one who kept his volatile dreams from burning up. We built our empire in the dark, with quiet calculation and mutual respect. Jessica built her flimsy kingdom in the blinding glare of a ring light, with noise and narcissism. The time had come. I stood up and walked to the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was not the one Jessica had thrown onto the sidewalk. The drab cardigans and sensible shoes were gone, incinerated and forgotten. In their place was an acris pantsuit in a shade of charcoal gray so dark it was almost black. The tailoring was impeccable, the lines sharp and unforgiving. My hair, once simply tied back, was now styled in a sleek, elegant chignon that highlighted the silver at my temples not as a sign of age, but of authority. My eyes, which had for years been clouded with the weary patience of a long-suffering mother, were now clear and cold as a winter lake. This was not a costume. It was a resurrection. I was no longer a widow in a house dress. I was the executor of a will that had yet to be read. I picked up the burner phone, sending a single pre-written text to my lawyer, Mr. Davies. "We are green." His reply was instantaneous. "Lobby in 5. The team is ready." I took one last look at the party across the street, a frantic, vibrant scene of impending doom. They were dancing on the ashes of my love, and they didn't even know they were the ones who had set the fire. The cool night air felt electric on my skin as I crossed the street. The doorman at Jessica's building, a young man who had always given me a pitying look when I'd come and go, barely recognized me. He saw the suit, the posture, the sheer force of my intent, and simply held the door open, his eyes wide. In the marble lobby my team was assembled. Mr. Davies, a man whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of grim satisfaction, gave a slight nod. Behind him stood 6 men, broad-shouldered and impassive, wearing the simple gray uniforms of a high-end moving company. They were not here to pack boxes with care. They were a demolition crew, and their job was to dismantle a life. "They're live," I said to Davies, my voice low and steady, broadcasting to over 1 million followers. A flicker of something that might have been a smile touched his lips. "Perfect," he said. "The public record will be impeccable." We rode the private elevator up to the penthouse in silence. The only sound was the faint, thumping bass seeping through the walls as we ascended. It felt like a rising heartbeat, a countdown. When the doors opened onto her private foyer, the noise was a physical assault. Laughter, shouting, music. The smell of expensive perfume and spilled champagne. I didn't hesitate. I walked to the heavy oak door and pressed the doorbell. Inside, the music stuttered to a stop. "Who the hell is that?" I heard Jessica's annoyed voice say. "The party's full, people." There was the sound of fumbling with the lock, and then the door swung open. For a second she didn't recognize me. She saw the suit, the lawyer, the phalanx of movers, and her face registered only irritation. "Can I help you? This is a private party." Then her eyes met mine, and the world stopped. The entitled annoyance on her face dissolved, replaced by a wave of utter, slack-jawed confusion. Her brain simply couldn't process the image. The mother she had discarded, the frumpy, sad old woman, was gone. In her place stood this creature of ice and steel. Her phone was still in her hand, pointed at her own face, but the camera lens was wide enough to capture me, standing on her doorstep like a specter of judgment. "Mom," she stammered, the word a weak, questioning puff of air. The phone wavered, and the view on the live stream tilted to show me, my lawyer, and the grim-faced movers in the hallway. The comments section I knew must be exploding. Behind her, Chad appeared, a stupid grin on his face. "Babe, who is it?" His grin vanished when he saw me. His face went pale. The other party guests, drawn by the silence, began to gather in the foyer, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. I didn't answer her. I simply held her gaze, letting the silence stretch, letting the cold reality of my presence sink into her bones. I let her 1 million followers watch her confusion curdle into fear. I had waited for this moment. I had earned it. I stepped over the threshold. Mr. Davies stepped forward, his voice cutting through the stunned silence with the clean, sharp sound of a guillotine blade. "Jessica Vance," he began, holding up a thick manila envelope. "This is a legal notice of eviction." A ripple of shock went through the assembled influencers. Jessica just stared at him, then at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Eviction? What are you talking about? I just sold this place. I'm the one who gets to evict people." "That is not factually correct," Davies continued, his tone utterly devoid of emotion. "You did sell this apartment. You sold it 48 hours ago to a holding company, Prometheus Capital, LLC. He paused, letting the name hang in the air. The sole proprietor of that LLC is my client. He gestured to me. Eliza Vance. As of 2 days ago, she is the legal and sole owner of this property. You are now a tenant in violation of your occupancy agreement. Jessica's laugh was a high, hysterical sound. That's insane. You're insane. This is some kind of sick joke. You don't have that kind of money. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a moment, looking for the weak, forgiving mother she knew. She found nothing. Mom, what is this? What are you doing? The movers, on a silent cue from me, began to walk past her into the living room. Their movements were precise, methodical. They ignored the party guests who scrambled to get out of their way. What are they doing? Jessica shrieked, her voice cracking. She lunged forward to stop the first mover, but he sidestepped her with an indifferent grace. Get out of my house. Get your hands off my things. That was my cue. I finally spoke, and I made sure my voice was calm, clear, and loud enough for the microphone on her phone to pick it up perfectly. The phone was now broadcasting the entire scene, her humiliation unfolding for the world she had so desperately courted. They are not your things, Jessica, I said. My voice didn't waver. It was the voice I used to use in the lab when explaining an immutable law of chemistry. And this is not your house. I took a step closer, forcing her to look at me. You see, when I gave you that $2 million, it wasn't a gift. It was a loan administered through a trust. A trust won control. And that loan had a contract. A contract you sign without reading. It contained a morality clause. I saw Chad's eyes widen. He was starting to understand. Jessica was still lost in a sea of denial. A morality clause, I repeated, savoring the words. It stipulated that the loan was contingent upon you providing your mother me with safe and respectful lodging. It stipulated that you were to treat me with dignity. I let a small cold smile touch my lips. Your little performance on the sidewalk a few weeks ago was a rather public and conveniently well-documented breach of that contract. Your livestream gave my lawyer all the evidence he needed. Invoking the clause meant the loan was void, and all assets purchased with it were to be immediately forfeited to the trust. Her face was a mask of horror. The truth was dawning on her, a slow, suffocating tide. This apartment, I said, gesturing around the opulent room, was the primary asset, so I took it. But the clause is quite comprehensive. It covers everything. I turned to the lead mover. Take the couch, the television, the art on the walls. It was all purchased with credit cards funded directly by the trust. No, she screamed, a raw animal sound. You can't. I can, I stated, my voice like a chip of ice. I am. The Persian rug was a housewarming present from the trust. It's mine. The $1,000 coffee machine in the kitchen. Mine. The custom sound system. Mine. I looked directly at her, then let my eyes drift down to the designer handbag slung over her shoulder. Even that ridiculous purse you're holding. It was bought with my money. It belongs to me. I turned back to the lead mover. He was waiting, his expression unreadable. Take everything, I instructed him, my voice ringing with an authority I hadn't used in years. And I mean everything. The clothes in her closet, the shoes on their racks, the food in her refrigerator. Box it all. I have arranged for it to be donated to the Austin Center for Battered Women. I'm sure they'll find a much better use for it. The movers descended upon the apartment like a swarm of locusts. Their efficiency was brutal, a masterclass in swift, dispassionate deconstruction. They worked in teams, communicating with quiet hand signals. One team began carefully taking the abstract paintings off the walls, revealing pale, blank squares of paint beneath. Another started unplugging the massive 8K television and surround sound speakers. The party guests, who had been frozen in place, now began to flee, whispering into their phones, desperate to distance themselves from the implosion of Jessica's world. They didn't want to be collateral damage. They scurried out like rats from a sinking ship, some even trying to sneak a bottle of champagne with them on the way out. Jessica stood catatonic for a moment, then she seemed to snap. Stop them, she shrieked at Chad. Do something. Chad looked from her to me, to the formidable movers, and seemed to shrink into himself. He saw the legal papers in my lawyer's hand. He saw the absolute conviction in my eyes. He was a predator but also a coward. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. He just shook his head, backing away. The movers entered the master bedroom. We could hear the sounds of drawers being opened, closets being emptied. They brought out armfuls of designer clothes, Gucci and Prada and Chanel, throwing them unceremoniously into large cardboard boxes. Each item was a memory of my daughter's casual cruelty: a dress bought with money she'd borrowed from my pension, a pair of shoes she demanded for her birthday while complaining about the cost of my medication. Jessica ran after them, trying to physically block their path. Those are mine. I'm an influencer. I need my things. The lead mover, a man built like a refrigerator, simply looked down at her. Ma'am, our work order is to clear the premises of all assets belonging to the trust. Please step aside. His voice was polite but immovable. She turned on me, her face contorted with a rage that was terrifying in its helplessness. You monster! How could you do this to me? I'm your daughter. You stopped being my daughter on the day you threw my life onto a sidewalk for sport, I replied, my voice dangerously quiet. You stopped being my daughter when you laughed at the idea of putting me in a nursing home. You made your choice, Jessica. You chose the things. Now you can see what it's like to have nothing but the choices you've made. They took the rugs, rolling them up to reveal the cold, polished concrete floors. They took the lamps, leaving wires dangling from the ceiling. They went into the kitchen and emptied the fridge and pantry, boxing up organic produce and gourmet cheeses. They even unbolted the custom Italian light fixtures, plunging the cavernous rooms into a stark, industrial gloom lit only by the ambient glow of the city outside. The speed was breathtaking. They were erasing her. In less than an hour, a home that had been a monument to shallow materialism was reduced to its skeletal form. Finally, there was nothing left to take. The last mover carried out the last box, which contained, ironically, the contents of her gratitude journal, and a stack of self-help books on manifesting abundance. The silence that descended was profound, echoing. Jessica and Chad stood in the center of the vast, empty living room. It was no longer a luxury penthouse. It was a concrete box in the sky. The expensive clothes they were wearing looked like costumes for a play that had abruptly ended. Their friends were gone. The caterers were gone. The life they knew was gone. Jessica's phone lay on the floor where she dropped it. The screen cracked, but the live stream still active. I could see the comments. They were no longer hearts and fire emojis. They were skulls. Millions of them, a rolling, endless river of digital mockery. The schadenfreude of the internet was a brutal thing to witness, and it was now turned on her with its full, merciless force. She had lived by the crowd, and now she was dying by it. She looked at me, her eyes finally empty of rage, filled only with a hollow, desolate understanding. The spoiled child was gone, and in her place was a woman who had just learned that the world had sharp edges. Why? She whispered, the sound swallowed by the emptiness. I considered telling her about her father, about the empire we built, about the legacy she had treated like garbage. But I didn't. She wouldn't understand. She didn't deserve to. My revenge was not about her understanding. It was about my liberation. I looked at her one last time, standing there in the ruins of the life I had funded and had now foreclosed upon. I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, not even satisfaction. Just a quiet, clean emptiness. The ledger was balanced. The debt was paid. I turned without another word and walked towards the door. Mr. Davies followed, closing his briefcase with a decisive snap. The sound echoed in the concrete box like a coffin lid closing. I didn't look back. The heavy steel doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing me in a capsule of polished chrome and profound silence. The last sound I heard from the world I was leaving behind was the thin, hysterical shriek of my daughter's voice. A sound that was immediately clipped and muffled, then erased completely. The chaos of the penthouse, the shattered glass, the overturned furniture, and the wailing of a life imploding was now a universe away, separated by a mere inch of metal. I didn't press the button for the lobby. The car was already in motion, a silent, controlled descent. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was not falling. I was being lowered gently into my own future. I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. For a moment, I expected to see the woman Jessica had created. The tired, stooped widow with faded clothes and an apologetic slump to her shoulders. The woman who ate her dinner in the kitchen, so she wouldn't disrupt the aesthetic of a curated dinner party. The woman who had become a piece of inconvenient, drab furniture in her own daughter's life. But that woman wasn't there. Staring back at me was someone else. Her posture was straight, her gaze unwavering. The lines on her face were not tracks of sorrow, but a map of hard-earned wisdom. The architect was looking back at me, and for the first time I recognized her without flinching. The grief for Robert, the years of self-imposed exile, the slow, corrosive acid of Jessica's contempt, it had all been a crucible. What emerged wasn't broken, it was tempered. The elevator chimed softly, a polite sound that signaled my arrival. The doors opened onto the vast, marble-floored lobby. The evening security guard, a young man who had always looked right through me as if I were a ghost haunting the building, now stood a little straighter. His eyes met mine, and he gave a short, respectful nod. He saw it too. The shift in gravity. I walked across the floor, the quiet click of my sensible, but expensive new shoes echoing in the cavernous space. This was the same path I'd scurried across 100 times, trying to make myself smaller and visible. Tonight I took up space. I owned the air I breathed. I was no longer an afterthought. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the humid Austin night. The city was alive, a symphony of distant traffic, music bleeding from nearby bars, and the ceaseless energy of 1,000 lives intersecting. It was the same air I had stood in just hours before. My belongings scattered at my feet like trash on the pavement. But it felt different now. It smelled of freedom. At the curb where a taxi would have once been an indulgence, a car was waiting. It wasn't just a car. It was a statement of silent, overwhelming power. A brand new graphite gray Lucid Air Sapphire. It looked less like it was manufactured and more like it had been sculpted from a single block of a meteor, sleek and predatory and utterly silent. A man in a simple dark suit stood beside it. He was from the security firm I had hired, the one that specialized in discreet asset protection and extraction. He didn't speak. He simply held out a hand, not with a key but with a sleek card-like fob. I took it. The material was cool and heavy in my palm. I didn't get in right away. I walked the length of the vehicle, my fingers trailing along its flawless surface. This was real. This was the manifestation of a life Robert and I had built in the shadows, a world of complex algorithms and thermodynamic calculations that had been hidden behind the facade of a quiet, suburban existence. This machine, powered by electricity and precision engineering, was the polar opposite of Jessica's world. A world powered by cheap validation and fleeting trends. And then I saw it on the back of the car. The custom license plate, illuminated by the soft glow of the taillights. It wasn't a clever pun or a string of numbers. It was a single word, forged in clean block letters: karma. A slow smile touched my lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph or glee. It was a smile of alignment, of a universal equation finally being solved. This wasn't revenge. It was a rebalancing, a correction. I had not taken anything from Jessica that wasn't already mine. I had simply removed the props from her stage, leaving her with nothing but the emptiness she had so carelessly cultivated. I slid into the driver's seat. The door closed with a soft, satisfying thud, encasing me in another world of silence. The interior smelled of expensive, sustainable materials and new technology. I placed my hands on the wheel. There was no engine to start, no roar of gasoline. I pressed a button and the vast, curved dashboard lit up. A constellation of information in a calm, cool blue. I was in the command center. My command center. I pulled away from the curb without a sound, the electric motors whining with a futuristic hum. The penthouse, Jessica's stage, her entire world, was visible in my side mirror for a fleeting second before I turned the corner. I didn't look back. There was nothing there for me. The memories I cherished, the ones with Robert and a younger, happier Jessica, were not in that sterile glass box. They were in the digital vault of the blockchain, in the lines of code we wrote together, and in the quiet corners of my own heart. The rest was just noise. Driving through the streets of Austin, the city lights streaked past, blurring into rivers of gold and red and white. I was anonymous, a ghost in a silent machine moving through the night. The weight that had settled on my chest for years, the constant low-grade anxiety of living on someone else's terms, began to lift. With every block I put between myself and that building, I felt my own soul expanding to fill the space inside me again. I was no longer a mother grieving a daughter who was still alive. I was a woman who had finally chosen to save herself. The hum of the electric drive began to fade, replaced by a deeper, more powerful drone. The blur of city lights outside my window dissolved into a soft, endless blanket of white. I was no longer on the ground. I was 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, slicing through the stratosphere. The transition had been seamless, a logical next step in my departure. Austin was a closed chapter, a book I had finally put back on the shelf. Across from me, in a plush leather seat, sat Julian, Robert's brother. For years, he had looked at me with a film of resentment in his eyes, a quiet accusation that I had somehow been responsible for Robert's decline. But tonight that film was gone. As he looked up from the technical journal he was reading, his gaze was clear. It held no warmth, not yet, but it held something more valuable: respect. He had seen the plan. He had understood the architecture of my response. He finally saw the partner his brother had loved, not the feeble widow he had pitied. He raised his coffee cup in a silent, subtle toast. I inclined my head, accepting the gesture. Our peace was made, forged in the quiet execution of Robert's final legacy. My own attention was on the tablet resting on the polished wood table in front of me. I wasn't scrolling through news feeds or social media, the digital town squares where my daughter had performed her own execution. I was looking at the interface for the Prometheus Trust. It was not a website or an app. It was a living blueprint, a universe of our own creation rendered in elegant, shifting lines of data. It was beautiful, complex, and utterly secure. A digital fortress Robert and I had built together, brick by cryptographic brick. He was the dreamer Morpheus who saw the potential in the void. I was the pragmatist, the biochemist who understood that even dreams are subject to the laws of thermodynamics, who engineered the cooling systems that kept his grand vision from melting down. My fingers hovered over the screen. For a moment I thought of Jessica. I pictured her in that empty concrete box, the echoes of the party now replaced by the ringing in her ears. Her friends, the fleeting allies of convenience, would have scattered like cockroaches in the light. Chad, a parasite who had sensed a dying host, would be gone by morning. She would be utterly, completely alone. I felt a pang, not of pity, but of a deep biological sorrow, the ghost of a love that had been. But it was like remembering a pain in a phantom limb. The connection was severed. She had chosen her path. Now I was choosing mine. With a steady hand, I typed a single command into the master console. It was a phrase Robert and I had designed years ago, a fail-safe for a future we hoped would never come. Initiate Protocol Phoenix. I pressed enter. On the screen, the intricate architecture of the trust began to shift. Old access keys, digital signatures tied to my former life, dissolved into nothingness. Entire chains of transactional history were sealed and archived, rendered inaccessible. And then a new structure began to generate. A cascade of alphanumeric characters, impossibly long and complex, flowed across the screen, weaving together to form a new set of cryptographic keys. A new digital identity, a new legal framework, a new life. The protocol was named Phoenix, but I was not rising from the ashes of Jessica's petty bonfire. My immolation had been a much slower, quieter process. It was the fire of a brilliant career sacrificed, of a husband's long illness, of a slow, creeping invisibility. Jessica's public humiliation wasn't the fire. It was just the final thoughtless flick of a match onto a pyre that had been building for decades. The process completed. A single, calm message appeared on the screen. Phoenix Protocol complete. Identity Eliza Reed archived. New identity active. I closed the tablet and looked out the window. Below us was a dark ocean, and ahead, the first faint hint of dawn was breaking on the horizon. My past as a victim, a role I had never auditioned for but had played for far too long, was now nothing more than a sealed archive in an unbreakable vault. My future as an architect, the builder of worlds both real and digital, was just beginning. And the sky, I realized, was wide open.